Hello everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Mariana. I am the Media and Production Creative Manager at The Foundry. And before I dive into what we're going to see in this webinar, in this video, I just want to give a big shout out to Dan Stein, who is and soon to be was an awesome member of my team. He is moving on, wanted to go back to production, and he is going to be greatly missed. So a big shout out to him, and of course also Nathan and Terry, because they are awesome and I would not know what to do without them in the creative team, because they help make the magic happen. Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at some workflows for creating a new stereo view out of a virtual reality comp. We're also going to take a look at some techniques for integrating CG elements using the new CARA VR ray tracer. So let's get started. Just jump right into it. What I got here is a comp that is all monoscopic, and over here we have a bunch of renders that were done in model. These are all spherical elements. And in addition, we have a plate that was shot using a VR rig. You've seen this footage in the previous webinar on stitching and keying using CARA VR and NUKE Studio. I think I showed the final version, the final comp, but in case I didn't, this is it. This is where everything has been integrated together. And that's all great, but it's all mono. And how awesome would it be if we could turn it into stereo? So what we want to do First off is add a new view to our comp. So I'm going to hit S to bring up the project settings, views, the views tab. All we have at the moment is the main view, and I can hit the plus button and I can add a new view, give it a name, etc. But instead of that, down below I have this handy button that allows me to set up views for stereo. So I'm going to click that instead. And what that does is create two new views, left and right, color-coded red and green. So now I have them available to me in my viewer, and I can toggle between them, which is always good. However, nothing has actually changed in my comp. It's the same view in both left and right. And I'm also going to turn on this little button, use colors in UI. It will use these two colors here to color code the pipes in my comp. That way it will be easy for me to see left and right eyes, and it will be way easier to know what's going on. First thing I need to do is pull in my stereo inputs. A lot of these elements were rendered out of model, and they were actually rendered out in stereo. But this whole comp was done using the left eye. So there's a couple of different ways I can approach this. The first way, let's come up here to our diffuse trees, for example, just to duplicate this over. Go on this node and navigate over to my diffuse trees here and pull in my right eye. Yep, this one here. Yep, there we go. I'm going to say yes. Now, if I view it, I have my left and right eyes for this, so that's great. And now I can use my join views node to combine this. I will attach left to right, right to right, and you can see, so left to left, right to right, and you can see the color coding I was talking about before. Now I combine these together and feed that into my comp, and now I have left view and right view feeding into my comp. Now this is one way to do it. It's a perfectly valid solution for this. But another good way to approach this is to come into my file path, and if I'm using any sort of naming conventions here that include left or right in it, in this case you can see the file names have an uppercase L for left. I can actually replace that for a %V for vendetta, or uppercase V. And that tells NUKE, that's a token, that tells it to create a view. So now, instead of creating a left, there is going to create a V. I will make it a lowercase v, and I will get just an L instead of uppercase V, which will give me the word left or right, depending what view I am in. Now I get an L in my view, and I can switch left and right. Now you can see this input has a little V up in the corner, and so now it's stereo. I didn't have to pull both eyes in, and I can do it either way. Works exactly the same. One is done with a single node and the other is done with separate nodes. So it might be a little easier to see if you have to do things individually on each pipe, or it just might be easier for you one way or the other. At the end of the day, it's the same result. So now I have to do that pretty much for every source that came out of Moda that has both left and right eye. In addition to that, I need to start paying attention to all the different nodes that are operating on these sources in my scene. As you see now that I've created a left and right view, every single node that has a new little box next to it. Now, before I did this, the little box, these two rectangles didn't exist. This is my stereo split knob or button, and by clicking on this, I get an option that says split off right. So let's say I did that for this particular knob we're looking at, split off right. I get a little arrow and I can drop down, and you can now see I've split this into left and right. And now this will allow me to operate on either the left and right eye separately. So if I view this node and adjust the slider, we can see I'm looking at my right eye. So actually, well, I see nothing right now, so let's change this one instead. I'll just do that. And of course, this is not what I want to do, but just to give you an idea. And now if I switch to my left eye, you can see it has not any effect on my left eye. You can use your split to affect your eyes differently, of course, or operate one or the other. Now I'm just gonna undo everything because this is not at all what I wanted to do. But that's something that affects pretty much every node in your scene. So you have to be very, very mindful of that when you're working in stereo. So another thing we need to be very conscious of is the roto nodes. We have to basically take a look down here to this part of our scene. We have some reflections being added in right here. We can take a look at that. We've created a roto mask to make sure these reflections don't show up in certain areas in the scene. But the problem is once this is in stereo, when we switch to a right eye, this is going to shift, but the roto is not going to shift. Oh, excuse me. This is why we have to be paying close attention to all of our rotos because those need to be converted as well. Now there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. If it's a very simple roto in just one spot, like right here, this little rock, I can potentially drop in a transform node in there, use that, the split knob, and then transform that left and right, or if it's more complicated rotos, such as in this case, I can use something called disparity. Now, to create that disparity, what I want to do first is render out a disparity map. I am going to do that by coming here and viewing my comp. At this point, I'm going to create a C disparity generator. This is a disparity generator node that comes along with CARA VR plugin. It's kind of a lightweight version of the disparity generator that was created in Ocula. Very similar idea, though the awesome thing about this one is it has the ability to work both in lat-long and rectilinear space. So you can get a disparity generated from a lat-long image, which is very, very, very sweet. So I can come here in this node, left and right views, leave those as is. Projection, I want to change this to lat-long, like so. Mask, I'm not going to mask anything, but I can potentially have the option to mask out the elements that I know are going to mess up my disparity, like stuff that's moving around really quickly, occlusions that I may not want to include, or if I only want disparity for a background or just a foreground, that's when I will use the mask option. The rest of these parameters I can tweak and adjust depending on the result that I get. Generally, I probably won't have to touch this. I can leave this as they are, see the result, and then tweak from there. But for now, I'm going to leave this by default, or at their default. Now I'm actually going to reduce the warps of it because this is not a scene with a lot of stuff going on. So I'm going to try to leave that lower, see if we can get away with this running a little faster. Now that I've done this, you'll see I have a new disparity channel in here. I will take a look at this, and this is going to take a moment to process, by the way. And this is going to do is give me a red, green, blue, and alpha channel. And this is both my right and left disparity, as well as both horizontally and vertically. The left disparity is actually giving me the disparity value I need to map my left view to my right eye, and vice versa. My right disparity is giving me the values I need to map my right eye to my left eye. Hope that's kind of clear, or very clear. So I've done this, I have my disparity, it's all good. what I would probably want to do at this point is pre-comp this out. So I would actually bake this out as a render so that I have it and it doesn't take so long to process. But for now, I'm going to leave it as is, and we're going to create a little postage stamp like so. Attach that to our disparity, bring that down here, and then take a look at this roto that we were looking at previously. Just test what's going on here. And I'm going to merge this roto over my plate. Then I'm going to put that in the alpha channel to see the roto on top of my plate. And all is good, and there we go. I can quickly see what's going on here. I can see it's covering these rocks, and I can also see if I switch eyes, it's not moving. My plate is moving underneath the roto. Parts that should be in the mask are going to fall out of the mask, and I can also see there's something weird going on my background shapes. Let me take a look at that. And I can see here one of my shapes is only in the right eye. And this is something we want to be very, very conscious of when we're working with rotos. Generally, when I set up my views, all of these should be set to left and right eyes. But I might have unchecked that when I was doing this earlier. But I want to make sure things are both in the left and right eyes when I'm doing this. Now, there might be times when I want to roto just the left or just the right eye. And in that case, I would set that accordingly. But overall, I want to check the rotos are always in both eyes. Now in this case, I have my disparity coming down, and what I'm going to do is take a look at our roto again. I'm going to copy that disparity into the stream under the roto, like so. Copy that in here. Now I'm going to not copy my alpha channel, and I'm going to copy the disparity as a layer, like that. And then I'm going to create an iDistort node. Now I'm going to do this right here. Now I'm going to drop this under my disparity, and now I'm going to set up the UV channels to use that disparity map, like that. Okay, expand this, yep, it's all there. Then I'm going to the UV scale, and right now I'm not concerned with the horizontal disparity, so I'll set the height to 0. Then I'm going to use the split box here to split off my left eye. And since we're working on our whole comp in the left eye, the roto is already going to be lined up properly when I'm viewing my left eye, or at least it's going to be lined up where it was set in the original comp. If I'm viewing right here, we can see and disable this. We can see that's where the roto was set for the mono comp. So technically, I don't want to touch that, but I do want to offset for my right eye. So let me go to my right eye. Let me enable this again, zero out this for my left eye, going to have my right eye convert my roto over. And now I'll see as I toggle between the two eyes, my roto mask is moving with my image. We can see here, let me zoom into the mask, that was defined earlier, is now instead of sleeping over the top of my image, is moving with the pixels underneath. And this means it's all good. Now the disparity is doing its job, and now that the roto has been successfully converted to match my image, so it's all good. Now when you're dealing with elements that might be a little bit more complex, this is a really good way to handle them. And by complex, I mean elements that might be falling under different levels of depth within your comp. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach my mask input to the iDistort node, and like I mentioned earlier, I would pre-comp this out previously so it wouldn't take as long to process. Though right now it's running fairly quickly in this machine. And yeah, and there we go. Now that's how I would handle rotos that are more complex. In addition to that, there's a few other things to consider, but I'm going to go through and set up the rest of the comp for stereo to then take a look at those in a moment. So bear with me, I'll be back in just a second. And I am back. That didn't take that long. And so now we have this comp and it's completely switched over to stereo. And as you can see, all of our elements have brought in both the left and right views. We've gone and converted all the roto nodes and all the nodes that needed to be changed. Now let's take a look at a couple of those and then we'll go through the CG stuff. We're using disparity for the rotos. It's been pre-comped, all good there. And now let's take a look at our characters, because we had to handle those a little differently since those were coming in natively as a VR stitch, not from a render element. We have our two dancers shot on a 16 camera rig. They had a green screen. They're stitched together in CARA VR. They were keyed out in NUKE Studio, and then of course the whole comp was done in the NUKE compositing environment. And of course they're mono, and we're doing some comp effects to them. But at some point we need to try to put those in stereo. And since they're pretty far away from the camera, and we're not seeing a lot of depth changes, we can kind of cheat stereo. But we may potentially want to get a little fancier than that at some point. But for now, we can cheat those a little bit and just move them left and right. Okay, so we're going to do that with CARA's Spherical Transfer. And you can see we're going from lat long to lat long. And on the left eye, we're doing -1. And in the right eye, we're doing +1. So now we're just moving them left and right. And the result is they're now shifted over and right in stereo, but left and right in stereo, but they're going to appear to be flat, right? Because there's no internal depth in them, and there's no other ways to approach that. But for now, we can leave this as is and assume that that's okay for this particular shot. And so there we go. And one other thing we might want to take a look at is this setup down here. We have a grid warp, and it's being used for setting up reflections. And here, actually, is something important to note. I mentioned how to offset rotos with disparity, and also how we convert rotos using a transform node with a split node. Another thing that we can use is enable the stereo option inside the roto nodes. As you see here, if I view my character, we're stenciling out the characters left and right. By default, this roto was done in the left eye, so when I move the right eye, it's not going to move. As you can see, in this case, the shape is big enough that it's okay. It covers them both. But just to prove the point as to how this will work, what I can do is use the stereo offset knob, which I'll have access to once I've set up my left and right views, to offset this shape in stereo within the node without having to do anything else. My favorite way of doing this is to create a new layer so I can keep the actual stereo offset separate. So now it's parented. And I'm going to select this layer. I'm going to shift this over to match. We can come in here, and I want to split my stereo offset knob. And in the X, I want to move my X attribute -22. Now you'll see as I switch, my whole shape is shifting and matching the movement on my character. And so now that's properly in stereo. And quickly to show how we came up with, we came up with this value of -22. What we have here is, of course, a 4K lat long image. So it's 4096. And what I know is when I'm panning 360 degrees, my image, I can pan. So if I hit G to create a grade, just to do this little NUKE calculation, I'm going to divide 4096 by 360. So that's about 11.3, but we'll say 11, roughly. But what we know, for every point that I move, when I pan, I'm moving my image offsetting by 11 pixels. I mean, give or take, roughly. So what I can do is look at my disparity, and I'm going to drop a pointer right here. So basically just hit Control, drop a sample there. Now I'm going to sample my disparity to map with a point, and I can see that my disparity is 24 pixels, roughly, where the dancer's foot was. So knowing that, and knowing that by moving a single point, I'm moving roughly a little over 11 pixels, I now know that by shifting this 1 in either direction, I'm giving myself a total offset of 22, 23 pixels. So that gets me more into the 24 range, roughly. Again, since we're using disparity, it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. Now I know that at a range of 22, 23, 24 pixels, is going to put these guys at a depth that I want them. That's how I figure out where the roto should be as well. Now, another thing I could or I need to do is using these grid warps. I'm using grid warps to move the reflections around, but the grid warps themselves need to move as well. Otherwise, they'll warp differently in each eye, and that's not going to look right. So let me come in here again, translate knob split that, and move the one eye over, same deal, so that the final thing we want to take a look at is this down here. So we've got this mask stenciled out, reflections, and in here, this is being done by splitting the left and right views using the same exact image and shuffling and inverting and rotating left and right eye. Now, the great thing about views is you can use them all in the same stream without having to do this process of splitting them out all the time. What we're going to do is copy over one of our eyes, the left eye. We're going to use that little trick we looked at earlier, where we're just going to add a %V into our file path to give it a token for left and right view. So now I have both views in there. And when we plug in a roto, I'm going to use that exact same trick to put my stereo offset. In this case, same thing, sample the disparity, figure out the value of that point, plug it in, and now my roto is moving. So now instead of having two separate streams doing this, I have all the same work being done in these 4 nodes. And I can create a stencil, so I can stencil, my stereo stream, and now I have the proper stereo being applied. It's giving me the exact same result that I would get here. And I guess one more quick note before moving on. You can see down here, same deal that I did on top, since there's a noise map being multiplied by this volume. If I've left that in mono, you'd get weird results where you get like a flat noise inside the volume, and that would probably tend to cause some stereo artifacts and look kind of weird. And again, using the CARA's disparity node, creating disparity from this volumetric path, and then pre-comping that out and applying that to the noise with the eye distort to get left and right eyes on our noise, like so. Okay, now let's move on to some CG, about time. So we're adding some CG elements into this comp, and to do that, I'm using an extra pair of passes that were rendered out of model very, very nicely. We have a surface point, we have our world point pass, we have our surface normals, and I can use those to create a long with the position to point node. So I can use both of those passes to create a point cloud. And let's take a look at that. Since they're spherical elements, I am going to get a very, very, very nice and pretty spherical point cloud. And as some of you know, point clouds are like my favorite thing in NUKE. They're so pretty, so pretty. So you can see this is awesome, and I have my entire scene represented as a point cloud. And this is now going to make it very, very easy for me to start placing any additional CG elements. Now, if I don't have this point cloud, I'll show you in a second another way on how I can create this type of pass. But for now, I do have those passes, and that makes my life a lot easier. Now, being brought in some models, I brought in some models, a few rocks, a little boat, and let's take a look at those. Okay, so there they are. And I've already positioned this exactly where I want them to be. And the beauty of that is I can see them exactly where I want them to be inside of the context of my VR scene. Now there's a transform geo in there to move this around, of course, and get them exactly where I want them to be, line them up. Then there's some basic materials being plugged in, foam, some diffuse textures, a normal to add a bit of bump, specular, nothing fancy, the usual things. Some materials are being passed through, some mats. Coming down, there's some basic lighting. There's a directional light and a fill light to simulate a bit of bounce lighting, and all comes down here. So there's a card that's being used with a fill mat on it that's going to allow me to create a holdout of the water. And so basically there's a plane so that these objects are held out by the water, and then we are going to get to CARA VR's Ray Render node, which is where all the magic happens. So we're using our spherical camera that we used in Modo, and this is just a plain spherical camera coming in from Modo with the exact same settings we had set up in there, and that feeds into our CARA array render nodes. And we want to make sure our projection mode is set to spherical, and our samples by default are going to be set to 0. And we definitely want to crank those up quite a bit to see the difference. If I set this back down to 0, okay, and now you can see I'm getting very ugly results. All this stuff over here is super crunchy. The edges look awful. It's basically just pretty disgusting. So you might want to crank this up quite a bit. I'm gonna set it to 20, and my image is gonna look way smoother, like right away. Now you can crank these values as much as you want, but after a certain point, you're probably gonna get diminishing results. So just play around with it, get a good value, and just make sure that your comp is not super slow, but you want your edges nice and smooth. And I realized that time is of the essence now, so I'm gonna try to speed this up. So I don't actually need to play with motion blur, but if I had to, I have this motion blur tab here, and I could turn it on, set my samples, my shutter offset, everything, so that this will calculate the motion blur. Generally, I'd like to render out a motion vector pass instead and use the new vector blur node inside of NUKE, because that's a lot faster. However, right now we're in virtual reality, so I'm not gonna worry about motion blur. Now this tab over here, I have the option to output AOVs, and for those of you who don't know what that means, it's arbitrary output variables. And so we can map out several of these different channels that are available here. So as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have a world position on our normals pass already rendered, you have the option to output it right here. So let's do that. Now for these geos, we're gonna do just that. And the great thing about this is I can come in here, and if I didn't have those, I can just pull in some Alembic caches or whatever, and then create these two passes, and then again use those to create a position to point pass. Now let's take a look at those two channels available to me right here. Normals, point world, very good, very pretty. And I can fit those same way, position to points pass, to get my very pretty point cloud, which we know and love. And so awesome. And again, I can do this for my whole scene. And so this will allow me to pull in all my geometries and do all the geos that I want and do the same thing. Now, the other thing that's great about this is I can start doing some relighting. So here's a red light and a blue light. And just as an example here, let's use the relight node. And using the same passes, normals, and world positions, and plug those in using the point cloud to see where to place my lights, and then use this as a reference tool. Then again, so I'm gonna switch back to my 2D mode, and there's my two lights right there being reflected onto my geometry. Now, this is a very basic relighting workflow, but it's pretty cool because, of course, since this is already in 3D, I can do all my lighting in the actual 3D. But if this was in 3D, I mean, I can use all those passes from Ray Render, so that's pretty great. So, yeah, so I have these passes, and I have all the basic shading feeding in, and they're all set to go. And I had initially render out a few mats to do some additional grading later on. So I'm going to create another CARA Ray Render node, and I'm going to apply, instead of a fill mat, I'm going to use the apply mat to apply a reflection material to that same card and use the rest of the same scene, but now a reflection material is on the card, and we can use that to create a reflection pass. So on my Ray Render node, all the same settings, I have all the same exact settings, but on my AOVs, now I'm gonna create a reflection layer and come over here and take a look at my reflection, and there we go. And now I have a very nice reflection of all of my objects that I can use to fake, reflection in the water. And in addition, on this particular one, I'm outputting for my key light on the shadows tab. I'm outputting a shadow mat. That's going to be pretty helpful down the road. Now, you can come in here and take a look at what that looks like. And I have this cool mat of my shadows. And of course, I'm also getting the self-shadowing of all the other objects that are in the scene. So I could clean that up a bit if I wanted to, potentially plug in separate geometries, and that had the receive shadow option turned off. But I didn't need to do that for this particular shot. So I'm fine. Now I have a map for my shadows, which is all great, and I can use that further down to add shadows to the water. And I have one final ray render node. This one's giving me ambient occlusion pass, and that's because I have my whole scene and all my objects, and I'm overriding all the materials and everything, on everything I mean. And I'm using the apply material node with this ambient occlusion shader, and I'm setting my samples and everything that I need to set in here, dialing this in the look that giving it the look that I want, and feeding that into a final ray render to get this beautiful, beautiful ambient occlusion pass. So now I have 3 ray renders set up. My main with my beauty and my mattes, my secondary one with reflections and shadow mattes, and my third one here with an ambient occlusion. So now we can actually start integrating this into the comp. So first off, we're going to add some reflections. I'm going to do a little blurring and a little grading and, everything to make it look really cool and integrated. Excuse me. And I'm going to refine this further. But for now, I'm just kind of showing the basics. And I got my shadow pass coming in here as well. So I'm just going to grab that and grab our shadow matte like that. So it's actually... drop this. It's actually not showing up. Okay, let me drop this in. Shuffle that out. Matte. Here we go. Drop that right there. Okay. So I'm multiplying using a grade node, and I'm adding that in. And so we're having our final result coming down here. I'm gonna do a little bit of extra grading into that and a little bit of softening. And, just adding a couple of things, make it nicer. And now merging that. And now we have our CG nicely integrated with the rest of our elements in our scene. Now, and because we were able to place it with the point cloud, we know exactly where everything's going to fall in space. And just dropping in a spherical transform, a CARA spherical transform. And I can see exactly... well, not exactly right there, but let me rotate this a bit to where the boat is. See, it's all very good. Now we've integrated some nice CG. However, the final thing that we need to do is if I now switch between my left and my right eyes and give it a second to calculate, well, the CG is still going to be monoscopic, right? So all my scene is in stereo. However, my CG is not. It's only in one night, and that's not going to be good, right? So what can I do about that? Well, it's very, very easy actually. So with a ray tracer, with the CARA ray render node, if I come back in here, there's this final tab that we didn't look at, and that is the camera tab. And because I've set this as a spherical projection, now the stereo enabled checkbox is now open, and I can come in here and click and allow me to set up my stereo scan. So of course I have to map my left and right view, and I'm going to use whatever values I used in Modo. And in this case, I have my eye separation to 2 to create the stereo look. And then I have one final set of options here, which is my fall off type. And this controls the fall off of my stereo, so it approaches the poles, or, the naders. So with stereo in VR, I want to have that flatten out as it reaches the poles of my sphere, because otherwise I'm gonna get very, very weird results as it crosses over. So basically I want those eyes getting closer and closer together as they reach the poles. And by setting this fall off type to none, well, that means there's not gonna be any fall off. I can set it to linear, and then that means it's going to be a very linear fall off ramp. Or I can set it to cosine and use this exponent to control it, and will be a very smooth fall off as it approaches the poles. Now I'm going to choose cosine, leave the fall off exponent to 1, and now you can see if I switch between my left and right eye, I'm getting a stereo result. And I didn't have to change anything else. I just had to turn on stereo scan, plug in the right stereo interocular distance and convergence that I wanted, and there we go, stereo. Pretty sweet, right? Pretty sweet. Now I'm going to update my precoms that I've already rendered. And now I have my stereo there. Everything is stereo, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Let me see, whole frame, give it a second to load. Left eye, right eye. Okay, so our beautiful reflections don't seem to be moving, so let me troubleshoot that really quick. Make sure our reflections are in stereo, left and right. Now something happened, unfortunately, those are not in stereo, so I'm gonna plug this in directly into the re-render to get my stereo result from that. And come in here, make sure to set this stereo scan, so now it'll be in stereo. Looks like our precom ended up just being a single line, but all good in the hood. And now we can just connect it directly into our tree and come down here and move down to the bottom of our comp to see our very, very, very nice final result. So there we go, final output. We've got our left and right eyes. We have our nice CG over here. Everything's moving very, very nicely, as it should. And of course, right now we could go into the headset for final review, or I could have worn the headset at any given time to make sure that everything is exactly where I want it to be and looking exactly like I want it to look. So hopefully all this has given you some good ideas on how to work in stereo after starting in a monoscopic virtual reality comp, because you can do that in NUKE. You can cheat it and it can look good depending on the shot, of course. And we also saw how to integrate CG using the awesome ray render node in CARA VR, and how to use the disparity node also inside of CARA VR. And I'm sorry I kind of like speed it up right there at the end, but I realized that I was running out of time, and this is not a cooking recipe for 6 hours. This is a webinar, so my time is up. Thank you for watching, world, and I will now jump onto the Skype thing to answer some of your questions. Thank you. Bye.